Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, your companion for another journey into shadow and reason. Tell me, can you hear the distant whistle of a train tonight? Or perhaps only the quiet settling of your own rooms as evening deepens? Tonight we board the Midnight Express, where fog conceals more than landscape, and a helpful face may hide the darkest intent. Watson learned aboard those rails that evil often wears respectability like a well-tailored coat. Do subscribe so no mystery passes you by. Now settle back, for there is no mystery so great as that which depends upon being unnoticed. Chapter 1. The Fog over Baker Street. It was upon a raw November evening in the year 1895 that I found myself once more in those familiar rooms at 221B Baker Street, where the firelight cast its warm glow against the encroaching gloom of a particularly dense London fog. The yellow vapour pressed itself against the windows with an almost sentient persistence, muffling the sounds of the great city beyond until even the clatter of hansoms upon the cobbles seemed muted and distant, as though we inhabited some island fortress cut off from the living world. My friend Sherlock Holmes occupied his customary position in the armchair nearest the fire, his long frame draped with characteristic negligence, his sharp features illuminated by the dancing flames. Yet despite the apparent languor of his pose, I detected in his grey eyes that restless quality which I had come to recognise as the prelude to either action or extreme irritability. The Baker Street detective was not a man who bore idleness well, and we had been without a case of any substance for nearly a fortnight. I had myself only recently returned from my consulting rooms in Kensington, where the autumn damp had brought with it the usual procession of bronchial complaints and rheumatic afflictions. As I removed my overcoat and crossed to the chair opposite Holmes, I caught his gaze upon me, and I knew at once that he had been observing my movements with that peculiar intensity which always preceded one of his startling demonstrations. "You have been to see young Carruthers again," he remarked without preamble. I confess I started slightly. "I have," I acknowledged. "But how on earth could you know that?" "Simplicity itself, Watson. The soot upon your right cuff is of the variety peculiar to the Paddington line, and there is a distinct odour of railway oil about your person. You have no reason to travel by that particular route, save to reach St. Mary's Hospital, where your former dresser Carruthers now holds a position. The hour of your return suggests you remained to dine with him, and the faint flush upon your cheeks indicates you shared a bottle of something rather better than hospital fare ordinarily provides." I could not help but smile at this performance, even as I marvelled once again at his capacity for extracting meaning from what seemed to me the most trivial of details. "You're quite right, as always. Poor Carruthers has been working himself to exhaustion with this influenza outbreak." Holmes waved a dismissive hand. "The medical profession has my sympathy, Watson, though I confess I find disease less interesting than crime. At least the criminal possesses ingenuity and intention, whereas the microbe is merely persistent." He reached for his pipe and began to fill it with that strong tobacco he favoured. "Have you noticed the recent items in the evening papers regarding railway accidents?" "I have skimmed them," I admitted, "though I cannot say I paid them particular attention. There are always such incidents, I am afraid, given the volume of traffic upon our lines." "Quite so. Yet these particular cases possess certain features which distinguish them from the common run of mishaps." He rose and crossed to the table where several newspapers lay scattered. 3 separate incidents in the past 6 weeks, Watson. In each case, passengers have simply vanished from late-night trains between stations. No bodies recovered, no explanations forthcoming. The railway authorities speak of confusion, of passengers alighting at wrong stops in darkness, but the families of the missing are less easily satisfied. I felt a stirring of interest despite myself. "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect nothing yet, save that the public's appetite for the sensational has been thoroughly whetted. Already there is talk of phantoms and curses, of vengeful spirits haunting the midnight rails. You know my opinion of the supernatural, Watson, that it inevitably resolves itself into the natural once sufficient facts are gathered." "Precisely. and yet I confess these disappearances present features of interest. The fog, you see, provides excellent cover for almost any variety of mischief." He gestured toward the window, where the vapour seemed to press ever more insistently against the glass. On such nights as this, a man might accomplish much that would be impossible under clearer skies. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the sound of the bell below, followed shortly by Mrs. Hudson's tread upon the stair. Our long-suffering landlady appeared at the door, her face betraying that mixture of exasperation and concern which seemed her perpetual state when dealing with my friend's irregular hours and unusual callers. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "A Mr. Edwin Marlowe. He seems most agitated, and would not be put off despite the lateness of the hour." Holmes's eyes brightened immediately. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson. Watson, I believe our period of enforced idleness may be at an end." The man who entered our rooms a moment later was perhaps 40 years of age, respectably dressed in the dark suit of a clerk or minor official, yet his appearance was that of one who had recently suffered some profound shock. His face was pale despite the chill of the evening, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. There was about him an air of barely suppressed agitation that spoke more eloquently than words of the urgency of his errand. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice unsteady, "I have come to you because I fear the police will not believe me. Indeed, I scarcely believe it myself, and yet I know what I have seen." Holmes gestured to the chair I had vacated. "Pray be seated, Mr. Marlowe. You are cold and frightened, and I perceive you have come directly from King's Cross Station. Whatever has driven you here through this abominable fog must be of considerable importance. Watson, perhaps some brandy for our guest." As I poured the restorative, Marlowe sank into the chair with evident relief. He accepted the glass with a nod of gratitude and took a long draught before speaking again. "I am a clerk with the Great Northern Railway, Mr. Holmes. For 15 years I've kept their books and managed their correspondence, and I pride myself on being a rational man. But what I've witnessed these past weeks has shaken that rationality to its very foundations. The disappearances aboard the midnight northbound express," Holmes said quietly. Marlowe's eyes widened. "You know of them?" "I have read the newspaper accounts, but I suspect you can tell me considerably more than has appeared in print. Proceed, if you please." Our visitor leaned forward, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, as though he feared being overheard even in the security of Baker Street. "There is a phantom aboard that train, Mr. Holmes, a figure that appears and vanishes like smoke, and wherever it is seen, men disappear. I have seen it myself, and I tell you frankly that had I not fled when I did, I too would have vanished into whatever darkness has claimed the others. Chapter 2. The Man Who Missed the Train." The silence that followed Marlowe's pronouncement was broken only by the hiss and crackle of the fire. Holmes had steepled his fingers beneath, his chin, a gesture I knew indicated his fullest attention, while his eyes never left the face of our visitor. For my own part, I confess that the word phantom had sent an involuntary chill through me, though whether from the theatrical nature of the claim or the evident sincerity with which it was delivered, I could not say. "You speak of what you have seen," Holmes said at length, his voice carefully neutral. "Yet I observe that you remain very much present, Mr. Marlowe, and not among the vanished. I should be interested to learn what distinguished your encounter from those of the unfortunate individuals who have disappeared." Marlowe drained the remainder of his brandy and set the glass aside with hands that had steadied somewhat. "I noticed something wrong, Mr. Holmes, a detail that saved me, though I cannot precisely articulate what it was, a wrongness about the man who sat opposite me in the carriage." "Describe him, if you please." "That is the difficulty. I can recall very little. He wore a dark coat and hat, as any traveller might on such a journey. His face remained in shadow despite the carriage lamps. But there was something in his manner, in the way he watched the other passengers, that struck me as predatory. When the train slowed between Finsbury Park and Wood Green, he rose and moved toward the corridor. I found myself following, though I cannot say why, and I saw him approach another passenger, a gentleman I recognised as Mr. Hargreaves, a securities clerk who travelled that route regularly. And then the lights flickered. It was but a moment, Mr. Holmes, scarcely longer than a heartbeat. When they steadied again, the corridor was empty. Both men had vanished. I searched the entire carriage in a state of near panic, but found no trace of either. At the next station, I fled the train and have not dared to board it since. Holmes rose and paced to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. How many disappearances in total would you estimate? 4 that I know of with certainty, perhaps more that have gone unreported or been attributed to other causes. And the railway authorities, what is their position? They speak of confusion, of passengers alighting at incorrect stops or continuing beyond their intended destinations. Inspector Finch of the Railway Police has interviewed numerous witnesses, but he finds no pattern, no evidence of criminal activity. He believes the incidents are coincidental, amplified by public hysteria and the natural human tendency towards superstition. Yet you do not share his assessment. I cannot, Mr. Holmes. I know what I witnessed. There came another ring at the bell below, and presently Mrs. Hudson appeared once more, looking distinctly harried. Inspector Finch to see you, Mr. Holmes, and he's brought 2 others with him. I've told them it's most irregular at this hour, but they insist the matter is urgent. Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally. It appears the matter pursues us even as we pursue it. Show them up, Mrs. Hudson. The inspector who entered was a man of perhaps 50 years, solidly built and possessed of that air of determined competence which characterises the better sort of police official. His weather-beaten face suggested long service, and though his eyes held a certain scepticism, they were not unkind. Behind him came a woman dressed in widow's weeds, her face pale beneath her veil, and a railway guard whose uniform showed the wear of regular duty. "Mr. Holmes," Finch began without preamble, "I understand Mr. Marlowe has called upon you. I came as soon as I learned of it, as I feared he might present you with an exaggerated account of what are, in truth, rather mundane incidents blown out of all proportion." "Inspector Finch," Holmes replied evenly, "you are welcome, though I note you bring companions. Perhaps introductions are in order." The widow stepped forward, lifting her veil to reveal a face marked by recent grief. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Graves, Mr. Holmes. My husband disappeared from the midnight express 3 weeks ago. The inspector tells me he likely continued to York by mistake, or perhaps took lodgings elsewhere for reasons of his own, but I know my husband's habits and his character. He would never have caused me such anguish deliberately." Her voice carried absolute conviction, and I found myself moved by the quiet dignity of her bearing. Holmes inclined his head with uncharacteristic gentleness. "I do not doubt your knowledge of your husband's character, madam. And you, sir?" He turned to the railway guard. "Thomas Bell, Mr. Holmes. I've been with the Great Northern for 12 years, and I've assisted Inspector Finch in his inquiries as best I'm able. These are troubling times for the railway, and for those of us who work upon it." "Mr. Bell has been most helpful," Finch interjected. "He's provided detailed accounts of the schedules, the staffing, the condition of the rolling stock. Everything points to natural explanations, yet the public will have their phantoms and their mysteries." Holmes had returned to his chair and was regarding our visitors with that peculiar intensity which suggested his mind was already ranging far beyond the immediate conversation. "Inspector, you strike me as a rational man. Yet you have come here tonight, which suggests that even you harbour some doubt regarding the sufficiency of your conclusions." Finch shifted uncomfortably. "I came to prevent the spread of further alarm, Mr. Holmes. These disappearances, if such they truly are, could be explained by any number of ordinary circumstances, but if Sherlock Holmes takes up the investigation, the newspapers will seize upon it as confirmation that something sinister is afoot. Your concern for the public peace is commendable, though perhaps misplaced. If there is indeed nothing amiss, my investigation will establish that fact. If, however, there is some agency at work beyond the merely coincidental, then surely it is better discovered than allowed to continue unchecked." Mrs. Graves spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "My husband feared something, Mr. Holmes. In the weeks before his disappearance, he seemed troubled, distracted. He spoke once of something he had signed years ago that might come to light. He would not elaborate, but I sensed it weighed upon him heavily. Did he specify the nature of this document? He did not, but he worked for the railway in various capacities over the years. If it was connected to his employment, there might be records. Holmes made a note in the small book he kept for such purposes. And the other missing persons, Inspector? What do we know of their backgrounds and circumstances? Finch produced a folded paper from his coat. Mr. Hargreaves, the securities clerk Mr. Marlowe mentioned, Mr. James Wickham, a journalist who specialised in railway matters, Mr. Graves, whom you've heard about, and a Mr. Peter Sutton, an engineer recently dismissed from the Great Northern's employ, all men of middling years and circumstances with no apparent connection beyond their use of the same train service. No apparent connection, Holmes repeated softly. Yet surely there must be some common thread, some element that links them beyond mere proximity. Bell cleared his throat diffidently. If I might suggest, Mr. Holmes, the Midnight Express itself is the obvious connection. Perhaps there is some defect in the rolling stock, some mechanical fault that has caused accidents the company wishes to conceal. An interesting theory, Mr. Bell. Tell me, in your 12 years of service, have you yourself witnessed anything unusual aboard these late-night trains? Nothing I would characterize as supernatural, sir, but the fog does strange things to sound and sight. A man might easily become disoriented, step from the train at the wrong moment, find himself injured or lost in the darkness between stations. Indeed he might, Holmes agreed, though his tone suggested he found the explanation less than satisfying. He rose and extended his hand to Mrs. Graves. Madam, you have my assurance that I shall look into this matter with all the resources at my disposal. Inspector, I trust you will afford me whatever cooperation lies within your power. Finch nodded reluctantly. I will share what information I have, though I maintain these incidents are being given far more significance than they warrant. After our visitors had departed into the fog-shrouded night, Holmes stood for some moments gazing into the fire, his expression unreadable. Finally he turned to me with a slight smile. Well, Watson, what do you make of our midnight phantom? I confess I am uncertain. The testimonies seem sincere, yet the explanations offered by Inspector Finch are not without merit. Ah, but therein lies the essential question, does it not? Why would rational men vanish from a moving train, leaving no trace, no sign of struggle, no indication of their fate? Tomorrow, my dear fellow, we shall visit King's Cross and examine this midnight express for ourselves. I suspect we shall find that phantoms, like all seemingly supernatural phenomena, leave remarkably tangible evidence when one knows where to look. Chapter 3. The Incident at King's Cross. The fog had lifted somewhat by the following morning, though the sky remained a sullen grey that promised rain before nightfall. Holmes had been awake since dawn, as I discovered when I emerged from my room to find him already dressed, and examining a railway timetable with his magnifying lens, a habit that never failed to amuse me, given that the print was perfectly legible to the naked eye. Ah, Watson, he greeted me without looking up. I trust you slept well. We have an appointment at King's Cross at 10:30. Inspector Finch has arranged for us to examine the midnight express during the daylight hours, when it sits idle in the depot. Has there been some development? A telegram arrived an hour ago. Another incident occurred last night. A Mr. Geoffrey Preston boarded the train at King's Cross bound for Peterborough. His luggage arrived at the destination. He did not. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Good Lord! Then the phantom strikes again. Holmes folded the timetable with precise movements. The phantom, as you call it, demonstrates remarkable consistency in its methods. That alone suggests human agency rather than supernatural intervention. Ghosts, in my experience, tend to be far less predictable than this particular spectre. We took a hansom to King's Cross, arriving to find the great terminus alive with the usual bustle of morning travellers. The acrid smell of coal smoke mingled with the sharper scent of steam, and the vast iron and glass roof echoed with whistles, shouts, and the perpetual rumble of locomotives. Inspector Finch met us at the entrance. To the depot, his expression grave. "This latest disappearance has caused considerable alarm, Mr. Holmes. The railway directors are most concerned about the effect upon custom. Already there are passengers refusing to travel on the late-night services." "Understandable, given the circumstances. Has Mr. Preston's family been notified?" "His wife received word this morning when the Peterborough station master telegraphed to inquire why Mr. Preston had not collected his bags. She insists her husband would never have left the train voluntarily, and I confess I am beginning to share her certainty that something untoward is occurring." Holmes's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Your scepticism is eroding, Inspector." "Excellent. A flexible mind is essential in our profession. Now, if you would be so good as to show us the carriage in question." We made our way through the maze of tracks and platforms to a quieter section of the depot where the midnight express stood in silent reproach, its dark paint and brass fittings dulled by soot and weather. The train consisted of a locomotive and tender, followed by 6 passenger carriages of varying classes, a guard's van, and a luggage compartment. It appeared unremarkable in every respect, yet I could not suppress a slight unease as we approached. Thomas Bell was waiting beside the third-class carriage, his honest face creased with worry. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I've kept the carriage locked since the incident last night, as the inspector requested. No one has entered it save the police." "Most commendable, Mr. Bell. You were on duty last night?" "I was, sir. I walked the length of the train at each station, as is my practice, and observed nothing unusual. Mr. Preston's compartment was empty when I checked it at Finsbury Park, though I had seen him board at King's Cross not 30 minutes earlier." Holmes produced his lens and began a meticulous examination of the carriage door. I watched as he traced the edge of the frame, with his long fingers, pausing occasionally to peer closely at some detail invisible to my own eyes. After several minutes of this silent scrutiny, he moved to the interior, beckoning me to follow. The compartment was typical of third-class accommodation. Narrow wooden benches facing one another, luggage racks overhead, and a small window that provided a view of the platform. The gas lamps remained unlit, leaving the space dim and cheerless. Holmes knelt to examine the floor, then turned his attention to the window fastenings. "Watson, observe the scuff marks here, near the door to the corridor." I bent to look where he indicated and saw faint scratches in the varnished wood, barely visible except when the light struck them at a particular angle. "They appear recent," I ventured. "Indeed, and note their direction. They run toward the corridor, not into the compartment. Something heavy was dragged, not carried. The depth of the marks suggests considerable weight, yet the pattern is inconsistent with luggage or any ordinary burden." He rose and moved to the corridor, his lens trained on the floor and walls with unceasing attention. Inspector Finch watched with poorly concealed impatience, while Bell hovered nearby with an expression of earnest concern. "Mr. Bell," Holmes said suddenly, "you mentioned walking the train at each station. At what intervals do the platform lamps operate?" The guard seemed surprised by the question. "They're on a standard timing system, sir. They illuminate 2 minutes before a scheduled arrival and extinguish 1 minute after departure. And between stations, the carriage lamps remain lit throughout the journey, powered by the generators, though I have noticed they occasionally flicker when we pass signal boxes, something to do with the electrical interference, I'm told." Holmes nodded absently, his attention fixed on a section of the corridor wall. "Inspector, do you have a lamp? The light here is insufficient for proper examination." Finch produced a bullseye lantern and directed its beam where Holmes indicated. In the concentrated light I could make out a faint discoloration on the wood panelling, no larger than a shilling. "What is it?" I asked. "Unless I'm much mistaken, Watson, it is a chemical residue. Note the slight oily sheen and the peculiar odour." He leaned close and inhaled deeply, then straightened with a thoughtful expression. Not coal tar nor any lubricant used in the maintenance of locomotives, something altogether different. Can you identify it? Not with certainty, though I have my suspicions. I should like to take a sample for analysis. He produced a small envelope from his pocket and carefully scraped a portion of the residue into it, sealing it with meticulous care. We continued our examination for another quarter hour, during which Holmes measured distances, tested door latches, and made numerous notes in his pocketbook. Finally he declared himself satisfied, and we emerged once more into the depot. "Your conclusions, Mr. Holmes?" Finch inquired with barely suppressed eagerness. "Premature to draw conclusions, Inspector, though I have formed certain preliminary hypotheses. Tell me, what became of the theory regarding secret tunnels and vagrant criminals that you mentioned to Mr. Marlowe?" Finch coloured slightly. "Mere speculation, I'm afraid. The station superintendent assures me there are no tunnels or passages beyond those documented in the official plans, and we have found no evidence of any unauthorised persons gaining access to the trains." "Yet someone is gaining access," Holmes observed. "4 men, possibly more, have vanished without trace. That suggests either extraordinary coordination or extraordinary opportunity." "Mr. Bell, you have been most helpful. One final question, if I may. The lamp timing you described, is it uniform throughout the system, or do individual signal boxes operate on independent schedules?" "Each signal box operates independently, sir, based on the traffic in its section. Why do you ask?" "Simple curiosity. The interplay of light and darkness can be most significant in matters such as these." Holmes turned to address us all. "Gentlemen, I propose to ride the Midnight Express this evening incognito. Watson, I should be grateful for your company, though I warn you the journey may prove tedious." "I would not miss it for the world," I assured him. "Excellent. Inspector, I shall require you to make no mention of my presence to anyone, including your superiors. If our phantom is to reveal himself, he must believe himself unobserved." As we departed King's Cross, I ventured to ask Holmes what he had truly discovered during our examination. He smiled enigmatically and tapped the envelope containing his sample. "Evidence, Watson. Merely evidence. But it begins to suggest a pattern, a method beneath the apparent mystery. Our phantom is not supernatural, of that I am now certain. He is, however, both clever and ruthless, which makes him all the more dangerous. You believe we are dealing with deliberate murder? I believe we are dealing with systematic elimination of inconvenient individuals. The motive remains unclear, but the method... the method begins to reveal itself. Tonight's journey should prove most illuminating." The rain that had threatened all morning began to fall as our hansom carried us back toward Baker Street. I gazed out at the grey streets and hurrying pedestrians, my mind troubled by the thought of what the coming night might bring. Holmes, however, appeared in excellent spirits, humming tunelessly as he contemplated whatever dark design he had begun to perceive in the tangle of clues we had gathered. "Tell me, Watson," he said at length, "what struck you as most significant about our morning's work?" I considered carefully. "The chemical residue, I suppose, though I confess I do not understand its relevance." "All in good time, my dear fellow, all in good time. First let us see what secrets the Midnight Express yields to direct observation. I have a fancy that our phantom may prove less ethereal than his reputation suggests, and considerably more human in his methods and his motives." Chapter 4. Clues in Motion. The evening found us once more at King's Cross, though we bore little resemblance to the gentleman who had visited that morning. Holmes had insisted upon disguises, and we presented ourselves as a pair of commercial travellers, he in a worn tweed suit with a false beard that transformed his aquiline features into something altogether more commonplace, and I in similar attire with spectacles of plain glass perched upon my nose. Our tickets were for York, and we carried modest carpet-bags to complete the deception. The station at night possessed a character entirely different from its daytime aspect. The crowds had thinned to scattered groups of weary travellers, and the great vault of the roof seemed to amplify every sound into an eerie echo. The midnight express stood waiting at its platform, wisps of steam curling from beneath the carriages like the breath of some sleeping beast. "Remember, Watson," Holmes murmured as we approached, "we are Mr. Harrison and Mr. Clark, travelling to inspect wool mills in the north. Speak little, observe much, and whatever occurs, maintain your composure." We boarded a second-class carriage, selecting a compartment that afforded a view of both the corridor and the platform. As the departure time approached, other passengers trickled aboard, a sparse collection of the sort who travel late, and for purposes seldom entirely explained. I noted their faces as Holmes had taught me. A clergyman with a pinched expression, 2 labourers who spoke in low tones, a woman whose widow's garb and downcast eyes discouraged conversation, and a salesman whose jovial manner seemed forced against the subdued atmosphere. The whistle sounded at precisely midnight, and, with a lurch and a grinding of wheels, we began our journey into the November darkness. Holmes had positioned himself beside the window, ostensibly reading a newspaper, but I observed his eyes constantly moving, cataloguing every detail of our surroundings. For the first quarter hour, nothing of note occurred. The rhythm of the wheels upon the tracks created a hypnotic cadence, and the gas lamps in our compartment flickered occasionally as Bell had described. Then, as we approached Finsbury Park, Holmes touched my arm lightly and directed my attention with the merest gesture toward the corridor. A conductor was making his way along the train, checking tickets and exchanging pleasantries with passengers. There was nothing remarkable in this, save that Holmes watched the man with peculiar intensity. When the conductor entered our compartment, Holmes presented our tickets with a mumbled greeting that perfectly matched his assumed character. "York, gentlemen, you'll find it cold this time of year," the conductor remarked, punching our tickets with practised efficiency. "Business calls, I'm afraid," Holmes replied, and the man moved on. Yet I observed that my friend's attention remained fixed upon the corridor long after the conductor had departed. We slowed for the Finsbury Park station, and passengers could be heard disembarking and boarding along the length of the train. Through our window, I glimpsed Thomas Bell making his rounds with his lantern, checking doors and offering assistance where needed. As the train resumed its journey, Holmes rose abruptly and stepped into the corridor, beckoning me to follow. We walked the length of the carriage as though stretching our legs, but I knew Holmes was searching for something specific. He paused at certain doors, testing their latches with movements so subtle I doubt anyone watching would have noticed. "This one," he whispered, indicating a compartment door near the end of the carriage. "Note how it closes." I listened as he gently pulled it shut. The latch engaged with barely a whisper of sound, far quieter than the other doors we had passed. "Recently oiled," I suggested. "Or recently adjusted. Mark its position, Watson. We are in the 3rd carriage from the locomotive, 4th compartment from the rear." We returned to our seats as the train gathered speed between stations. Holmes produced his pocket watch and consulted it frequently, his lips moving in silent calculation. At length, he leaned close and spoke directly into my ear so that none might overhear. "In approximately 3 minutes, we shall pass mile marker 47. Watch carefully what transpires with the conductor's lantern." I fixed my gaze upon the corridor where the conductor stood speaking with a passenger. The minutes stretched with agonizing slowness. Then the train began a gentle curve, and I saw through the far window a white marker post flash past. At that precise instant the conductor's lantern dimmed, not entirely but noticeably, as though a valve had been partially closed. The effect lasted perhaps 5 seconds, then the light returned to its former brightness. Holmes's eyes met mine with an expression of grim satisfaction. He said nothing, but withdrew his pocketbook and made a rapid note. For the remainder of the journey to Peterborough, he maintained his silent vigil, occasionally consulting his watch, occasionally making notations, but offering no explanation of what he had observed or what it signified. We alighted at Peterborough shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, and Holmes immediately engaged the station master in conversation regarding the maintenance schedules of signal lamps. I confess the technical discussion was largely beyond me, involving as it did the intricacies of oil reservoirs and wick adjustments, but Holmes appeared to glean considerable satisfaction from the information provided. Only when we had secured rooms at a nearby commercial hotel did he consent to explain his observations. "Watson, what did you make of our journey?" "I saw the lantern dim at the mile marker as you predicted, but I confess I do not grasp its significance." Holmes paced the narrow confines of our room, his energy undiminished despite the lateness of the hour. "The significance lies in the precision, my dear fellow. That lantern dimmed at an exact location, a location that could be predetermined and anticipated. It was not a mechanical failure or a random fluctuation in the oil supply. It was deliberate manipulation. By whom? The conductor? Possibly, though I observed nothing suspicious in his manner or movements. More likely, the effect is produced by some external agency, someone positioned along the track at that specific point. To what purpose? Consider what such a signal might communicate. A moment of controlled darkness, occurring at a predictable location. It would serve admirably as a timing mechanism, would it not? A signal that some action should be taken, some movement initiated. I felt a creeping unease as the implications became clear. You believe it marks the point at which the victims are removed from the train. I believe it marks one element in a carefully choreographed sequence. The chemical residue I discovered this morning is another piece of the puzzle. It was not coal tar or lubricant, Watson. It was a preparation used in the preservation of signal lamps, a compound containing specific oils and paraffins designed to maintain a steady flame in adverse conditions. Good heavens, then someone with access to railway maintenance supplies is involved. Indeed, and consider further, who has both the authority to move freely throughout the train and the technical knowledge of signal lamp maintenance? Who would be above suspicion, welcomed rather than questioned when moving between carriages and stations? The guards, I breathed, but surely not Bell. He seemed so genuinely concerned, so helpful in the investigation. Holmes's expression grew dark. I have learned, Watson, that the most dangerous criminals are often those who cultivate the appearance of virtue. Yet I do not accuse Bell hastily. We require further evidence, further observation. Tomorrow we shall return to London and pursue another line of inquiry. What line is that? The victims themselves. Mrs. Graves mentioned that her husband feared exposure over something he had signed. We must discover what connects these missing men beyond their unfortunate choice of transportation. There is a pattern here, a selection process. Our phantom does not strike at random. I lay wakeful for some time after we retired, my mind churning over the evening's events. The quiet compartment door, the dimming lantern, the chemical residue, each detail seemed innocuous in isolation, yet together they formed a disturbing picture of deliberate calculation and cold-blooded efficiency. Holmes, I knew, would not rest until he had unravelled every thread of the mystery. Yet I could not shake the feeling that we were dealing with an adversary of unusual cunning, one who had operated with impunity for weeks, and who would not surrender his secret without resistance. The phantom of the Midnight Express, whatever his true nature, had claimed 4 victims at least. I prayed we would unmask him before he claimed a 5th. The following morning brought a telegram from Inspector Finch. The police had arrested a suspect in connection with the disappearances. A disgraced former railway engineer named Albert Pritchard, recently dismissed for incompetence and known to harbour grievances against the company, had been taken into custody based on circumstantial evidence placing him in the vicinity of King's Cross on the nights in question. Holmes read the telegram with an expression I knew well, a mixture of irritation and resigned amusement. The inspector means well, Watson, but he has seized upon a convenient scapegoat. I shall be very much surprised if Mr. Pritchard proves to be our man. You believe him innocent. I believe him irrelevant. Our phantom is no disgraced engineer nursing petty resentments. He is methodical, precise, and above all, He possesses continuing access to the railway's operations. Mr. Pritchard, I suspect, will be found to have an alibi, or else the evidence against him will prove too weak to sustain a conviction. Meanwhile, the true culprit continues his work unmolested. Then we must return to London at once and demonstrate Pritchard's innocence. On the contrary, Watson, we must return to London and demonstrate someone else's guilt. There is a considerable difference between the two propositions, and the latter requires far more delicate handling. Come, we have a train to catch, and I have several lines of inquiry to pursue that cannot wait upon the ponderous machinery of official investigation. Chapter 5. Voices in the Fog. We return to London that voices. Same afternoon, and Holmes wasted no time in pursuing the investigation with characteristic vigour. He had sent several telegrams from Peterborough, and by the time we reached Baker Street, replies were already awaiting him. He read them in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration, then thrust them into his pocket and announced that we should spend the evening conducting interviews. The victims, Watson. We must understand who they were and what they knew. Mrs. Graves spoke of her husband's fears. I suspect similar anxieties plagued the other missing men, and therein lies our answer. Our first call was upon Mrs. Graves herself, whom we found in modest lodgings in Islington. The widow received us with a composure that spoke of long practice in mastering grief, though her eyes betrayed the sleepless nights that had followed her husband's disappearance. Holmes expressed his condolences with a gentleness I had rarely witnessed in him, then gradually turned the conversation toward matters of fact. Mrs. Graves, when we last spoke, you mentioned that your husband feared exposure over something he had once signed. I must ask you to search your memory most carefully. Did he give any indication, however slight, of the nature of this document? She twisted a handkerchief between her fingers, her gaze distant. He was not a man given to confidences, Mr. Holmes, but I remember one evening, perhaps a month before he vanished, when he had taken rather more wine than was his custom. He spoke of his early years with the railway, when he worked in the certification office. He said something about approvals that should never have been granted, about pressure from superiors to overlook certain deficiencies. Deficiencies in what respect? He would not say, but he seemed haunted by the memory, and he spoke of signatures on documents that might one day be questioned. He feared his name appearing on records that could cause him shame, or worse. Holmes leaned forward. Did he mention any specific individual who might have exerted this pressure? A supervisor, perhaps, or a colleague? No specific names, though he did say that one man had risen far beyond his merits, climbing over the bodies of others, as he put it. I took it for the usual office resentments, but now I wonder if there was more to it. We thanked her and departed, Holmes deep in thought. Our next destination was the family of Mr. Hargreaves, the securities clerk who had vanished in Marlowe's presence. His sister, a sharp-eyed woman of middle years, received us in her Clerkenwell home with barely concealed hostility. "The police have arrested someone," she said flatly. "They say this Pritchard fellow murdered my brother out of some mad revenge against the railway. What more is there to discuss?" "I am not convinced Mr. Pritchard is responsible," Holmes replied. "Your brother worked in securities, did he not? What were his specific duties?" He verified investment documents, assessed the railway's financial obligations. Tedious work, he always said, but reliable employment. Her expression softened slightly. He was a careful man, methodical. In recent weeks, he had seemed troubled. When I pressed him, he admitted that he had discovered irregularities in old records, discrepancies in figures that had been signed off years ago. Did he specify what these irregularities concerned? Something to do with safety equipment, I believe. Purchases that were documented but never made, or made in inferior quality to what was recorded. He spoke of consulting with others who might have knowledge of the matter, men who had worked in various departments over the years. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Did your brother mention any names?" "Only that he had arranged to meet someone on the midnight express. He said it would be safer to speak away from the office, where they might be overheard. That was the night he disappeared." We took our leave and made our way through the gathering dusk to Bloomsbury, where the widow of Mr. Wickham the journalist occupied rooms above a bookshop. She proved to be a woman of remarkable composure, educated and articulate, who spoke of her late husband with quiet pride. James specialised in railway matters, she explained. He'd been researching a series of articles on safety standards, comparing the practices of different companies. He believed there was a story of considerable public interest to be told. Had he uncovered anything specific, Holmes inquired. He had obtained documents suggesting that certain safety certifications had been falsified years ago. Equipment that should have been replaced was instead simply recertified on paper. James was attempting to trace who had authorised these certifications when he vanished. Her voice caught slightly. He had mentioned receiving a threatening letter, warning him to abandon his inquiries. I begged him to comply, but he said the public had a right to know. This letter, do you still possess it? She produced it from a writing desk, a single sheet in an educated hand that read simply, "There are matters best left buried. Continue your inquiries at your peril." It was unsigned. Holmes examined it minutely, holding it to the light and studying both the paper and the ink. "May I retain this, madam? If it helps you find who took my husband from me, you may do whatever you wish with it." Our final interview was with the family of Peter Sutton, the dismissed engineer. His brother, a shopkeeper in Suffolk, spoke with barely suppressed anger. They say Peter was mad, that he had grievances that drove him to violence. Lies, all of it. He was dismissed because he refused to sign off on repairs that were never properly completed. He had principles, did Peter, and they cost him his position. What became of him after his dismissal? He tried to find work elsewhere, but word had spread. They said he was difficult, unreliable. The truth was he knew too much about how corners had been cut, how records had been altered to hide inadequate maintenance. He told me once that if anything happened to him, I should look to those who had most to lose from the truth emerging. Did he name anyone? He said there was a man who had built his career on convenient blindness, who had signed approvals he never properly verified, and who had protected others in exchange for their support of his own advancement. But Peter never gave me a name. He said it was safer that I not know. As we emerged into the night air, the fog had returned, wrapping the city in its familiar shroud. Holmes walked in silence for some minutes, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile sharp against the gaslight. "A pattern emerges, Watson. Each victim possessed knowledge of falsified documents, of safety certifications granted improperly, of corners cut and records altered. Each was investigating or had investigated these matters, and each disappeared before they could reveal what they knew. Then we are dealing with a conspiracy to conceal past malfeasance. More than that, we are dealing with someone who has much to lose should these old sins come to light, someone whose current position depends upon those past corruptions remaining hidden. But who? And how does this connect to the mechanics of the disappearances themselves?" Holmes stopped beneath a street lamp, his eyes distant. "Consider the requirements, Watson. Our culprit must have detailed knowledge of railway operations, sufficient authority to move freely and without question, access to technical equipment such as signal lamp preparations, an intimate familiarity with the schedules and routes of the Midnight Express. He must also have been in a position years ago to influence or approve safety certifications. That narrows the field considerably. It does indeed. And there is one more element to consider. The victims did not disappear randomly. They were selected, targeted, eliminated systematically. That requires advanced knowledge of their intentions and movements, someone who could identify threats before they materialized. We had reached Baker Street, and Holmes bounded up the stairs to our rooms with renewed energy. He spent the next hour pacing before the fireplace, pausing occasionally to consult his notes or stare into the flames as though seeking answers in their dance. Finally he turned to me with an expression of grim determination. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall visit the railway's administrative offices. I wish to examine employment records, promotion histories, and certification authorities from a decade past. Somewhere in those dusty files lies the key to our phantom's identity. and if Inspector Finch's arrest of Pritchard proves correct, then I shall apologise handsomely and retire from detective work forever. But I do not think that outcome likely. Our Phantom is no disgraced engineer consumed by petty revenge. He is a successful man, a respected figure, someone who has cultivated an appearance of virtue while concealing a history of corruption, and he has killed at least 4 times to protect that facade. I retired that night with a sense of gathering momentum, as though we stood upon the threshold of revelation. Yet I could not suppress a chill at the thought of the calculating intelligence we pursued, a mind capable of such systematic elimination of obstacles, such ruthless preservation of self-interest. The Phantom of the Midnight Express was no supernatural entity, but in his cold humanity, he seemed to me far more terrifying than any ghost could ever be. Chapter 6. The Respectable Mask. The morning brought one of those rare December days when the London sky clears to a pale winter blue, and the smoke from 1,000 chimneys rises straight as columns into the still air. Holmes had been awake before dawn, and I found him already returned from some errand, his cheeks flushed with cold and his eyes bright with purpose. "I have secured permission to examine the railway's administrative archives," he announced as I took my breakfast. "The director himself has granted us access, though I suspect his cooperation owes more to concern for the company's reputation than any genuine desire to uncover uncomfortable truths. We presented ourselves at the Great Northern's headquarters shortly after 10 o'clock, and were conducted to a dusty repository in the basement where personnel files and operational records stretched back decades. A nervous clerk had been assigned to assist us, though Holmes quickly dismissed him with assurances that we could manage our own researches. For 3 hours we worked in near silence, Holmes examining employment histories while I reviewed certification records. The work was tedious, requiring careful cross-reference between multiple ledgers, but gradually a picture began to emerge. I traced the signatures on various safety approvals from the early 1880s, noting the same names appearing repeatedly: Graves, Wickham in his capacity as a junior inspector, and several others, including a clerk named Bell. "Holmes," I called softly, "I have found something of interest." He joined me at once, peering over my shoulder at the ledger I had opened. Thomas Bell's signature? Yes, I had expected as much. But this shows him working in the certification office 10 years ago, not as a guard. He approved numerous equipment purchases and safety inspections during that period. Indeed. And if you examine the dates carefully, Watson, you will note that many of these approvals coincide with the irregularities our victims had begun to investigate. Bell was not merely present during the period in question. He was actively involved in the very processes now suspected of corruption. I felt a chill despite the closeness of the archive. Then he has been complicit from the beginning, or he has been the architect of the entire scheme. Consider his career trajectory. Holmes produced his pocketbook and consulted his notes. Thomas Bell entered railway service as a junior clerk in 1880. Within 3 years he had risen to a position of authority in the certification office, signing approvals for substantial equipment purchases. Then, rather abruptly in 1888, he transferred to service as a guard, a position of lower apparent status but greater freedom of movement. Why would a man voluntarily accept such a demotion? Perhaps because his activities in the certification office had become too visible, too likely to attract scrutiny, or perhaps because the transfer was not voluntary but rather an alternative to dismissal. Either way, he maintained his employment and his access to railway operations, while removing himself from direct association with the paperwork that might one day prove incriminating. Holmes returned to his own researches, pulling file after file with practiced efficiency. He paused over one document in particular, studying it with such intensity that I ventured to inquire what he had discovered. Bell's employment record contains a curious gap. For 6 months in 1887, he was suspended from duty pending an internal investigation. The investigation was ultimately closed without action, but the original complaint alleged falsification of inspection reports and acceptance of inferior equipment in exchange for certain considerations. He was being bribed. So it was alleged. Yet the investigation found insufficient evidence, or perhaps sufficient influence was brought to bear to ensure its quiet conclusion. Bell returned to his duties. The complaint was expunged from official records save this single notation, and the matter was forgotten. Until men who knew of it began to disappear. Holmes closed the file carefully and sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled in contemplation. We have established motive and opportunity. Bell possesses the technical knowledge, the access and the history that connects him to the falsified certifications. He has been systematically eliminating those who threaten to expose his past corruption. Then we must inform Inspector Finch at once. Not yet, Watson. We have circumstantial evidence, suggestive patterns, but nothing that would satisfy a court of law. Bell could claim coincidence, could argue that his presence in the certification office was merely unfortunate timing, that his transfer was a simple career choice. We require proof of his direct involvement in the disappearances themselves. The chemical residue you found, surely that connects him to the crime. It connects someone with access to signal lamp preparations to the crime. Bell has such access, but so do numerous other railway employees. No, we need to demonstrate the mechanism of the disappearances to show precisely how Bell accomplishes his work and to catch him in the act. We emerged from the archives into the pale afternoon light, and Holmes suggested we take tea at a cafe near the station where we might observe the comings and goings of railway staff. It was there, quite by chance, that we encountered Thomas Bell himself, just concluding his shift and making his way homeward. He greeted us with every appearance of pleasure, his honest face betraying no sign of guilt or unease. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, have you made progress in your investigation? The arrest of that engineer fellow has been the talk of the depot." "Mr. Pritchard's guilt remains to be proven," Holmes replied evenly. "I have been examining certain historical records that may bear upon the case." "Historical records?" Bell's expression showed polite interest, nothing more. "Employment histories, certification approvals, the usual administrative detritus that accumulates over years of operation. Tedious work, but occasionally illuminating. I should think modern crimes would require modern evidence. Mr. Holmes." "On the contrary, I often find that present actions have their roots deep in the past. A man's history shapes his choices, would you not agree?" "I suppose that's true enough." Bell shifted his weight, glancing at the station clock. "I must be getting home. My wife expects me for supper, and she's particular about punctuality." "Of course. But before you go, I wonder if I might impose upon your expertise once more. I should like to ride the midnight express again this evening, and I would value your company. There are certain details regarding signal lamp operations that remain unclear to me." I saw the briefest hesitation cross Bell's features, a momentary calculation behind his eyes, before his customary helpful expression returned. "I'm not scheduled for duty tonight, Mr. Holmes, but I'd be happy to arrange it. The night supervisor owes me a favour." "Excellent. Shall we say 11 o'clock at King's Cross?" After Bell had departed, I turned to Holmes with some confusion. Why alert him to your suspicions? Surely that was unwise. On the contrary, Watson, it was essential. I wished to observe his reaction, to see if the prospect of another journey aboard the midnight express would provoke any revealing response. Did you note his hesitation? He is not comfortable with the idea, yet he cannot refuse without arousing suspicion. You believe he will attempt something tonight? I believe he will be exceedingly careful, which is precisely what I require. A cautious adversary reveals his methods through the very precautions he takes. Holmes consulted his watch. We have several hours before our appointment. I suggest we use them to prepare for what may prove a decisive confrontation. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes spent the remainder of the afternoon in activities both mysterious and methodical. He examined various items from his chemical apparatus, tested the mechanism of a dark lantern, and wrote several telegrams in his precise hand. Finally, he produced 2 heavy walking sticks from the stand in the corner. "Best be prepared, Watson. I do not anticipate violence, but Bell is a desperate man protecting a decade of corruption. Desperate men are unpredictable. I checked my service revolver and slipped it into my coat pocket, an action that brought a slight smile to Holmes's lips. The old campaigner prepares for battle. Good. Tonight we shall finally see our Phantom in his true colours, and I fancy the revelation will strip away the respectable mask he has worn so long and so successfully. As darkness fell and the time for our appointment approached, I found myself gripped by an anticipation mixed with apprehension. We had pursued this investigation through fog and shadow, through interviews and archives, through careful observation and logical deduction. Now, aboard the Midnight Express once more, we would face whatever truth lay at the heart of these mysterious disappearances. Holmes seemed supremely confident as we made our way through the evening streets toward King's Cross, yet I detected beneath his assured manner a tension that spoke of the stakes involved. We were not merely solving a puzzle or demonstrating our intellectual superiority. We were confronting a killer who had operated with impunity for weeks, who had refined his methods to near perfection, and who would not surrender without employing every resource at his command. The station loomed before us, its lights blazing against the gathering darkness, and somewhere within its bustling precincts, Thomas Bell waited to guide us once more aboard the train that had become the scene of his crimes. I tightened my grip upon my walking stick and followed Holmes into the terminus, wondering what the night would bring. Chapter 7. The Case Appears Solved. Our planned journey aboard the Midnight Express was forestalled by dramatic developments that very evening. As Holmes and I took our supper before departing for King's Cross, Inspector Finch arrived in a state of barely suppressed triumph, accompanied by a reporter from the Evening Standard and an air of official vindication. "Mr. Holmes," he announced before he had even properly entered our sitting room, "I thought you should hear the news directly from me. We have secured a confession from Albert Pritchard. The case is solved." Holmes set down his fork with deliberate care, his expression utterly unreadable. "Indeed. Pray be seated, Inspector, and tell us how this remarkable development came about." Finch settled himself with evident satisfaction, waving away Mrs. Hudson's offer of refreshment. Pritchard broke under questioning this afternoon. He admitted to harbouring grievances against the railway, acknowledged his presence near King's Cross on several of the nights in question, and finally confessed to engineering the disappearances as an act of revenge against the company that dismissed him. "How convenient," Holmes murmured. "And the mechanism of these disappearances? How did he accomplish them?" "He claims to have concealed himself aboard the trains, waited until they were between stations, then overpowered his victims and disposed of them along the trackside. The bodies, he says, were hidden in locations he refuses to divulge until certain legal assurances are provided." "I see. And his motive for selecting these particular victims?" Finch consulted his notes. "He states they were chosen at random, representing the railway he blamed for his misfortunes. Any passenger might have served his purpose equally well." I glanced at Holmes, expecting him to challenge this patently inadequate explanation, but he merely nodded thoughtfully. "Fascinating. And the evidence that supports this confession?" "We found maps of the railway lines in his lodgings, along with newspaper clippings about the disappearances. His landlady confirms he kept irregular hours and often returned late at night with mud upon his boots. He had both opportunity and motive, and now we have his confession. The magistrate is satisfied, the railway directors are relieved, and the public will sleep more soundly knowing the Phantom has been apprehended." "No doubt," Holmes agreed, his tone carefully neutral. "I congratulate you upon your success, Inspector." After Finch had departed, bearing with him the reporter who would undoubtedly craft a suitably dramatic account for the morning editions, Holmes rose and paced to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "You do not believe Pritchard is guilty," I observed. "I believe Pritchard is a convenient scapegoat who has served his purpose admirably. Consider the confession, Watson. Random victims? Nonsense. We have established beyond question that each missing man possessed knowledge of railway corruption. Bodies hidden along the trackside. After weeks, surely some trace would have been discovered by maintenance crews or track inspectors. The entire account is designed to satisfy public anxiety while protecting the true culprit. But why would Pritchard confess to crimes he did not commit? Why indeed? Perhaps he was promised leniency on some other charge. Perhaps he was offered money for his cooperation. Perhaps he was simply broken by the pressures of interrogation and told his questioners what they wished to hear. Men in desperate circumstances often make choices that seem incomprehensible to those of us more fortunate. He returned to the table and unfolded a large railway map, pinning it to the wall with the casual disregard for Mrs. Hudson's decorating preferences that had become habitual. Observe, Watson. Here are the locations where the disappearances occurred, or more precisely, where the victims were last seen. What pattern do you detect? I studied the map carefully. They all fall along the same route, between King's Cross and Peterborough. Precisely. And what does that suggest? That the culprit operates within a specific territory, one he knows intimately, or one in which he has authority and routine access. Now consider this. He produced the railway timetable and laid it beside the map. The disappearances all occurred on nights when Thomas Bell was scheduled for duty aboard the Midnight Express. I obtained the duty rosters this morning from the railway offices. Good Lord, that cannot be coincidence. It cannot. Yet Inspector Finch has his confession. The newspapers will trumpet the capture of the Phantom, and Thomas Bell will continue his duties unmolested. It is precisely what our true culprit would wish. Then we must act quickly, before the focus shifts entirely to Pritchard. Holmes shook his head slowly. On the contrary, Watson, we must allow events to proceed exactly as they are proceeding. If Bell believes himself safe, if he thinks the investigation concluded and public attention diverted, he may grow careless. Moreover, I require one final piece of evidence to complete my understanding of his method. What evidence is that? The exact mechanism of removal. I know when and where he strikes. I know why he selects his victims. But I do not yet know precisely how he accomplishes the physical act of making men vanish from a moving train. That knowledge is essential if we are to prove his guilt beyond legal challenge. Over the following days, the newspapers were indeed filled with sensational accounts of Pritchard's arrest and confession. The Evening Standard ran a particularly lurid illustration depicting the deranged engineer lurking aboard the Midnight Express, while the Times published a more sober analysis of railway security measures and the psychology of revenge. Public interest reached a fever pitch, then gradually subsided as other matters claimed attention. Holmes spent these days in what appeared to be idle contemplation, smoking prodigious quantities of tobacco and occasionally consulting his commonplace books. Yet I knew this apparent, languor masked intense mental activity. He was assembling the final pieces of his puzzle, testing hypotheses against known facts, constructing the irrefutable logic that would ultimately expose Thomas Bell. On the third day following Pritchard's confession, Holmes emerged from his reverie and announced that we would make one more visit to King's Cross. I have been studying the railway's signal system, Watson. It is more sophisticated than I initially appreciated, with multiple redundancies and safety features designed to prevent accidents. Yet every system has its vulnerabilities, and I believe I've identified the one that Bell has exploited. We found Bell at the depot, supervising the loading of parcels onto the afternoon service. He greeted us with his customary affability, showing no sign of unease despite Holmes's continued interest in the case. "Mr. Holmes, I heard about the arrest. Terrible business, but at least it's concluded. The men are much relieved to know they're safe." "Are they?" Holmes replied enigmatically. "I wonder if safety is quite as assured as they imagine. Tell me, Mr. Bell, in your years of service, have you ever observed irregularities in the signal lamp operations between stations?" Bell's expression remained open and friendly, though I detected the merest pause before he responded. Signal lamps are maintained by specialised crews, Mr. Holmes. I'm just a guard. My knowledge of such technical matters is limited." "Of course. Yet you mentioned previously that you had noticed lamps flickering when trains pass signal boxes. That suggests closer observation than one might expect from someone with merely limited knowledge." "I suppose I pay more attention than most. Years of routine will do that to a man." Holmes smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "Indeed it will. Routine creates patterns, and patterns can be most revealing to one who knows how to read them. I wonder, Mr. Bell, if we might prevail upon you for one final journey aboard the Midnight Express. Not tonight, but perhaps tomorrow evening. There are certain observations I wish to make under your expert guidance." Again that momentary calculation behind the eyes swiftly masked. "I'm scheduled for duty tomorrow night as it happens. You're welcome to ride along, though I'm not sure what more you hope to discover now that the Phantom has been caught. Call it professional thoroughness. I like to understand completely how a crime was committed even after the criminal is in custody. Until tomorrow evening, then." As we walked back through the station concourse, I ventured to ask Holmes why he continued to alert Bell to his suspicions. "Because, my dear Watson, I am giving him a choice. He can attempt nothing and hope his luck holds, or he can make one final effort to eliminate the threat I represent. Either way, tomorrow night will bring clarity. I have taken certain precautions, arranged for certain witnesses to be in position. When we board that train, we shall finally see Thomas Bell's true nature revealed. You expect him to attempt violence? I expect him to follow the pattern he has established so successfully. The question is whether he will recognise that the pattern itself has become his prison, that in perfecting his method he has also created the means of his own exposure." That evening Holmes was unusually contemplative. He sat before the fire long into the night, a glass of wine untouched at his elbow, his keen features illuminated by the dancing flames. When at last he spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall demonstrate that the most dangerous criminals are not those who work in darkness and shadow, but those who hide behind respectability and routine service. Bell has built a fortress of normalcy around himself, has cultivated trust and deflected suspicion through years of patient performance. But every fortress has its weakness, and tomorrow we shall find his." Chapter 8. The One Detail. Morning brought a telegram from Mycroft Holmes, delivered while we breakfasted. Sherlock read it without comment, then passed it to me. The message was characteristically terse. "Your engineer theory flawed stop guards alone handle signal preservation compound stop M. Your brother has been making inquiries on your behalf," I observed. "I imposed upon his connections within the railway administration. Mycroft has an encyclopedic knowledge of governmental operations, and the railways, being essential to commerce and defence, fall within his peculiar sphere of interest." Holmes buttered his toast with unusual deliberation. "His confirmation is most satisfactory. I confess I do not grasp the significance. Then allow me to illuminate what has been obscured by misdirection and assumption. You will recall the chemical residue I discovered in the corridor of the Midnight Express, the substance I could not immediately identify, but which suggested itself to be connected with railway maintenance. You said it was used in signal lamp preservation. Precisely. And therein lies the detail that Inspector Finch and his colleagues have entirely overlooked in their eagerness to accept Pritchard's confession. The compound in question is not used in locomotive maintenance, nor in the general upkeep of rolling stock. It is employed exclusively in the preservation of signal lamps along the track, a specialised preparation designed to maintain steady illumination in adverse weather." I set down my cup, beginning to perceive the direction of his reasoning. And who has access to such materials? According to Mycroft's information, only guards and signal maintenance crews. The substance is toxic in concentrated form and strictly controlled. It must be signed for when drawn from supply, and detailed records are kept of its distribution and use. Then, if this compound was present in the carriage, it could only have been introduced by someone with authorized access to signal preservation materials. Not a dismissed engineer nursing grievances, Watson, but an active employee with specific technical responsibilities, someone like Thomas Bell. Holmes rose and crossed to the wall where his railway map still hung, now annotated with numerous markings in his precise hand. Observe the pattern once more, but this time consider not merely the locations of disappearances, but the technical infrastructure surrounding them. Each incident occurred at or near a section of track where signal lamps require frequent maintenance due to particular exposure to weather or mechanical stress. Bell would have legitimate reason to handle the preservation compound in those very locations. Exactly. Now consider further. Mycroft's inquiry also revealed something else of considerable interest. The preservation compound, while essential for lamp maintenance, has another property that makes it particularly suited to certain criminal applications. In its concentrated form, when the fumes are inhaled in an enclosed space, it produces rapid unconsciousness. Not death, mind you, but a stupor lasting several minutes. The implication struck me with the force of revelation. He sedated his victims. I believe so. The chemical residue I found was not evidence of legitimate maintenance, but the trace left by the application of concentrated fumes. Consider the sequence. Bell identifies his target, someone whose knowledge threatens his past corruption. He waits until the train reaches a predetermined section of track, a location he knows intimately from his technical duties. At the precise moment, using his authority as guard, he enters the victim's compartment carrying the compound concealed in some innocuous container. The lantern, I breathed. The conductor's lantern that dimmed at mile marker 47. Holmes's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. You begin to see it, Watson. The dimming was not a signal to an external confederate, but rather Bell's own action. He briefly extinguished his lantern to release fumes from the preservation compound into the confined space of the compartment. The victim, already rendered drowsy by the late hour and the rhythm of the train, would have succumbed within moments. Bell need only wait for the appropriate section of track, then dispose of the unconscious passenger. But how? The train is moving, and surely someone would notice a body being removed. But that is where Bell's intimate knowledge of the route becomes essential. I have been studying the engineering surveys of the line, Watson. Between certain stations, there are brief sections where the track runs very close to maintenance access points, small platforms used by repair crews. The train slows on these sections due to curves or gradients. A man with Bell's strength could easily move an unconscious victim through a carriage door and onto such a platform in the few seconds available. The darkness, the noise of the train, the isolation of the location, all would favour success. I felt slightly ill as the full horror of the scheme became apparent. And the victims, what became of them? I suspect they never regained consciousness. The compound in sufficient concentration can prove fatal, particularly if the victim is already weakened or has underlying health conditions. Bell would have had no particular interest in their survival once they had been removed from the train. The bodies could be concealed in the trackside brush or disposed of more permanently at leisure. This is monstrous. It is methodical murder disguised as mystery. Bell has exploited every advantage afforded by his position, his freedom of movement, his technical knowledge, his familiarity with the route, and most crucially his appearance of helpful cooperation. Who would suspect the friendly guard who assists in the very investigation of crimes he himself committed? Holmes began to pace, his movements sharp with suppressed energy. Yet for all his cleverness, Bell has made errors. He could not know that I would detect the chemical residue, could not anticipate that I would trace its significance. He relied upon the natural human tendency to accept supernatural explanations over mundane calculation, upon Finch's desire for a swift resolution, upon the convenience of a scapegoat in the person of Albert Pritchard. Then we must inform the inspector at once. With what evidence, Watson? Chemical residue that might have innocent explanations? Employment records showing Bell worked in positions where corruption occurred a decade ago? Coincidence of duty rosters? No jury would convict on such circumstantial threads. We require direct proof, witness testimony, evidence that cannot be explained away or dismissed. Then what do you propose? Holmes checked his pocket watch. Tonight we shall ride the Midnight Express one final time, and we shall not ride alone. I have arranged for certain reliable individuals to be strategically positioned throughout the train. If Bell attempts to employ his method again, he will find himself observed and apprehended. If he does nothing, recognizing the trap, we shall still have the satisfaction of preventing another murder. You believe he will attempt something despite the risks? I believe Bell is a man who has grown confident through success, who has refined his technique until he considers it nearly infallible. Moreover, I've made myself an obvious target. I'm investigating when the case is supposedly closed. I'm asking uncomfortable questions about technical matters that touch upon his specific expertise. If he perceives me as a threat, and he must, then his pattern suggests he will attempt to eliminate that threat using his proven method. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Holmes spent the afternoon in final preparations, sending and receiving telegrams, reviewing his notes, and making several mysterious trips to various locations about the city. He returned from one such excursion with a small glass vial containing a clear liquid. Oil of peppermint, Watson. It has the useful property of overwhelming the sense of smell when applied to a handkerchief. If my theory regarding Bell's method is correct, this simple precaution may prove our salvation. As evening approached and the time for our departure drew near, I found myself checking my revolver with unusual frequency. Holmes noticed and smiled grimly. I do not anticipate violence of the conventional sort, my dear fellow. Bell's method has always been subtle, designed to leave no obvious evidence of foul play. He will not resort to crude assault when he has perfected so elegant an alternative. Nevertheless, your preparedness is commendable. We departed Baker Street shortly before 11 o'clock, the night clear and cold, with stars visible in the gaps between chimney smoke. As our hansom carried us toward King's Cross, Holmes sat in unusual silence, his profile sharp against the passing streetlights. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible above the clatter of hooves. Tonight we shall see whether justice can overtake calculation, whether methodical observation can expose methodical crime. Thomas Bell has operated with impunity for weeks, has killed at least 4 men to protect his sordid past. But every criminal, however clever, makes assumptions about his own invulnerability. Tonight we shall demonstrate that his most dangerous assumption was believing himself unobserved. The great terminus loomed before us, its lights blazing in the darkness. Somewhere within its iron and glass confines, Thomas Bell waited to guide us onto the Midnight Express. I tightened my grip on my walking stick and followed Sherlock Holmes into what I knew might prove the most perilous journey of our long partnership. Chapter 9. The Phantom Unmasked. Thomas Bell awaited us on the platform with his customary lantern, his face bearing that expression of helpful earnestness I had come to recognize as the most perfect mask I'd ever encountered. He greeted us warmly, showed us to a first-class compartment he had reserved for our use, and expressed his hope that our journey would prove uneventful now that the Phantom had been caught. Though I confess, he added with apparent sincerity, I sleep easier knowing that Madman Pritchard is locked away. To think he might have struck at any of us, at any time, it chills the blood. Indeed, Holmes replied, settling himself by the window. Random violence is always unsettling. Give me a methodical criminal any day. At least one can understand his logic, anticipate his movements. Bell lingered at the compartment door. Will you require anything during the journey, Mr. Holmes? I'm at your service, as always. Your company, if you can spare it. I had hoped we might discuss certain technical aspects of railway operations as we travel. There are details regarding signal maintenance that continue to puzzle me. I saw the calculation behind Bell's eyes swiftly masked. I'd be delighted, though my knowledge is limited to a guard's perspective. Shall I return once we're underway?" "At your convenience." The train departed on schedule, and we slipped into the familiar darkness beyond the station lights. Holmes had positioned himself with unusual care, ensuring he could observe both the corridor and the passing landmarks outside. He had given me the handkerchief treated with peppermint oil, instructing me to keep it readily accessible but concealed. "He will come to us, Watson, rather than summoning us to him. It affords him better control of the situation. When he does, be prepared for subtle actions rather than obvious threats. Everything he does will appear innocent to casual observation." We had been travelling perhaps 20 minutes when Bell returned, sliding the compartment door closed behind him with a movement so natural it aroused no suspicion. He carried his lantern in one hand and a small leather case in the other, which he set upon the seat. "I brought some documentation regarding signal systems, Mr. Holmes. Thought it might illuminate our discussion." He smiled at his small pun. Holmes leaned forward with apparent interest. "Excellent. I am particularly curious about the preservation compounds used to maintain consistent illumination. I understand they are quite specialized." "They are indeed. Toxic in concentrated form, actually. We handle them with considerable care." Bell opened the leather case and began removing papers, and I observed with growing tension that his movements positioned him between us and the door. "I imagine the fumes alone might prove dangerous in an enclosed space," Holmes continued conversationally. "Oh, certainly. In concentrated form they can produce unconsciousness in moments. That's why we only apply them in open air, with proper ventilation." Bell's voice remained steady, but I noticed his hand had strayed to the lantern's valve. "Fascinating. Tell me, Mr. Bell, how long have you been carrying such concentrated compounds with you on duty?" The question hung in the air like a suspended blade. Bell's hand froze for the merest instant, then continued its motion with studied casualness. "I don't carry them routinely, Mr. Holmes. Why would I?" "Why indeed? Yet I detected residue of such a compound in this very train not 5 days ago. Most curious, wouldn't you say?" Bell's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the helpful mask slipping to reveal something harder beneath. "I'm sure there are innocent explanations. Maintenance crews work throughout the train during daylight hours." "Quite so. Yet the residue was found in a pattern inconsistent with routine maintenance. It was found precisely where one might expect it if someone had released concentrated fumes in the enclosed space of a passenger compartment." The train had begun to slow, approaching a curve I recognised from Holmes's map as one of the points where the track ran close to a maintenance platform. Bell's hand moved to the lantern valve, a gesture that might have seemed unconscious to anyone not watching for it. "You appear to have developed quite elaborate theories, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps too much time studying matters best left to railway professionals has led your imagination astray." Holmes rose with sudden purpose, his voice cutting sharp and clear. "My imagination serves me well enough, Mr. Bell. Or should I say, Mr. Bell, who once worked in the certification office, who signed approvals for equipment never properly inspected, who accepted compensation to overlook deficiencies that endangered lives, who was suspended for corruption but somehow retained his employment through the influence of others equally compromised." Bell's affable expression had vanished entirely. His hand tightened on the lantern, and I saw him glance toward the door, calculating distances and possibilities. "Accusations without proof, Mr. Holmes. The ravings of a detective who cannot accept that his services were unnecessary." "Without proof? On the contrary, I have chemical evidence, employment records, witness testimony, and most damning of all, your own actions tonight. Did you truly believe I would walk unprotected into your trap, that I had not anticipated your method and prepared accordingly?" As if in response to a signal, the compartment door slid open to reveal Inspector Finch and 2 constables, who had been positioned in the adjacent compartment. Behind them stood several railway officials whom Holmes had quietly recruited to witness the confrontation. Bell's face underwent a remarkable transformation, the mask of respectability cracking to reveal naked calculation. With a motion so swift it seemed almost desperate, he He adjusted the lantern's valve fully open. I caught the acrid smell of the preservation compound beginning to fill the compartment, but Holmes was faster, producing the peppermint-soaked handkerchief and pressing it to his face while simultaneously throwing open the window to admit the rushing night air. "Seize him!" Holmes commanded, his voice muffled by the handkerchief. The constables moved forward, but Bell proved unexpectedly agile. He hurled the lantern toward them, causing them to stumble back from the spreading fumes, and made for the corridor. I intercepted him with my walking stick, catching him across the shins and sending him sprawling. In an instant, Finch was upon him, securing his wrists with manacles while the railway officials threw open every door and window to ventilate the noxious fumes. Holmes stood at the window, breathing deeply of the clean air, his eyes alight with grim satisfaction. When sufficient ventilation had been achieved, he turned to face Bell, who sat slumped on the floor, his expression one of absolute defeat. "Thomas, Bell," Holmes began, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment, "you stand exposed as the Phantom of the Midnight Express, though your crimes are far more mundane than that theatrical appellation suggests. You are a murderer, systematic and calculating, who has killed at least 4 men to protect your sordid history of corruption and fraud." "You cannot prove it," Bell muttered, though his voice carried no conviction. "Can I not? Let us review the evidence. You worked in the certification office during the period when fraudulent approvals were granted for safety equipment. You accepted bribes to sign off on inspections never properly conducted. When threatened with exposure, you transferred to guard duty, maintaining your access to railway operations while distancing yourself from the incriminating paperwork." Holmes began to pace, his movements precise as a prosecutor presenting before court. "When men who knew of your corruption began investigating those old records, you eliminated them using your position's unique advantages. You had access to signal preservation compounds capable of producing unconsciousness. You knew the routes intimately, knew precisely where the train slowed near maintenance platforms. You could enter any compartment without arousing suspicion. You needed only to select your moment, release the fumes, wait for your victim to succumb, then remove the unconscious body at the predetermined location. The lantern dimming at mile marker 47 was your signal to yourself, was it not?" I added, finding my voice. A reminder of when to prepare for action. Bell's shoulders sagged. "They would have destroyed me, all of them, digging into the past, asking questions about approvals granted 15 years ago. I had built a respectable life, had a wife who believed in me, colleagues who trusted me. I could not let them take that away." "So you took their lives instead," Holmes said quietly. 4 men, possibly more, silence too. Protect your reputation and position. You cultivated the appearance of helpful cooperation, deflected suspicion towards supernatural explanations, and when that proved insufficient, allowed an innocent man to be arrested for your crimes. Finch had regained his composure, though his face was pale with shock and, I suspected, embarrassment at having been so thoroughly deceived. "Mr. Holmes, I owe you an apology. I was too eager to accept an easy solution, too willing to believe in Pritchard's confession." "The confession was surely obtained through coercion or inducement," Holmes replied. "I suggest you investigate how it came about. You may find that Bell had more involvement in Pritchard's arrest than mere coincidence would suggest." Bell looked up, and for a moment something like genuine emotion crossed his features. "I never meant for it to go so far. The first one, Graves, I only wanted to frighten him, to convince him to abandon his inquiries. But the compound was stronger than I realized, and when I removed him from the train, he never regained consciousness. After that, there seemed no alternative but to continue. Each new investigation threatened to uncover the previous crimes, as well as the original corruption. A cascade of murder to conceal a cascade of fraud," Holmes observed. "How very tragic and how very predictable. Evil compounds itself, Mr. Bell. The first compromise leads inevitably to greater ones, until a man finds himself so deep in darkness that he can no longer perceive the light." The train had slowed to a halt, and additional police awaited at the platform. As they led Bell away, he paused and turned back to Holmes. "How did you know?" he asked. "What was it that betrayed me?" Holmes considered for a moment. "You were too helpful, Mr. Bell. Too eager to assist, too ready with explanations, too present at every stage of the investigation. Innocent men do not cultivate proximity to those investigating crimes. They go about their business and trust in justice. Your very cooperation was your condemnation." Chapter 10. The End of the Line. The weeks following Thomas Bell's arrest brought a curious mixture of public sensation and official discretion. The newspapers, having trumpeted Pritchard's confession with such confidence, were forced to print retractions and apologies. The unfortunate engineer was released with compensation, though I doubt any sum could restore the damage done to his reputation and peace of mind. As for the railway company, they moved swiftly to distance themselves from Bell's crimes, while quietly conducting their own investigation into the certification frauds of a decade past. Several bodies were eventually recovered from locations along the track that Bell, in exchange for certain considerations regarding his eventual sentence, agreed to disclose. The families of the victims could at least provide proper burial, though such closure seemed cold comfort for losses so brutally inflicted. Mrs. Graves attended her husband's funeral with a dignity that moved all who witnessed it, and I was pleased to learn that the railway had settled upon her a pension in recognition of their employees' ultimate honesty in attempting to expose corruption. Holmes took little satisfaction in the resolution, despite the completeness of his triumph. He had solved the mystery, exposed the criminal, and prevented further murders, yet the case seemed to weigh upon him in the days that followed. I found him one evening standing at our window, gazing out at the Baker Street traffic, with an expression of unusual melancholy. "You're troubled, Holmes," I ventured, "yet you have every reason for satisfaction. Justice has been served." "Has it, Watson? Bell will hang, certainly, and that may satisfy the letter of the law. But what of those who pressured him into the original corruptions? What of the supervisors who turned blind eyes to fraudulent certifications, who created the environment in which such malfeasance could flourish? They remain in their positions, untouched and unexamined. You cannot solve all the world's injustices. No, but I can recognize them for what they are. Bell was a murderer, make no mistake. His crimes were calculated and cold-blooded. Yet he was also a man who might never have killed had he not first been corrupted by a system that valued expediency over integrity, profit over safety. The railway directors who now expressed such shock and dismay were content enough with those falsified certifications when they saved money and avoided delays. He turned from the window, and I saw in his face a weariness that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. The Phantom of the Midnight Express was no supernatural entity, Watson, but neither was he entirely of his own making. We create our monsters through the choices we collectively make, the standards we collectively abandon. I had no ready answer to such philosophy, and we sat for a time in companionable silence. At length, Holmes roused himself and managed a slight smile. "Forgive my gloomy reflections. You will want to add this case to your collection of narratives, I suppose. What shall you call it? The Adventure of the Vanishing Passengers? The Mystery of the Midnight Phantom? I thought perhaps the Phantom of the Midnight Train, if you have no objection. It will serve well enough, though I trust you will emphasize the methodical nature of the investigation rather than any dramatic confrontations. The case was solved through patient observation and logical deduction, not through violence or theatrical revelations. I shall endeavour to be faithful to the facts. See that you are, and Watson, when you write of Bell, try to capture the essential tragedy of the man. He was not a monster born, but a monster made, shaped by years of small compromises until large crimes seemed merely the logical extension of what had gone before. Inspector Finch called upon us, several days later, bearing news that Bell had made a full confession and providing additional details that Holmes had not yet obtained. The inspector's manner was considerably more humble than during our earlier encounters, and he acknowledged frankly that he had been too hasty in accepting Pritchard's confession. "I allowed public pressure and the desires of my superiors to cloud my judgment, Mr. Holmes. It is a mistake I shall not make again. We are all fallible, Inspector. The question is whether we learn from our errors. I suspect you will emerge from this affair a better investigator for having encountered its complexities." After Finch departed, Holmes retrieved a telegram that had arrived that morning and passed it to me. It was from Mycroft, congratulating his brother on the successful resolution, while noting with characteristic dryness that the affair had caused considerable embarrassment in certain governmental circles where railway safety was concerned. "The government will conduct inquiries," Holmes observed. "New regulations will be proposed, safety standards revised, oversight strengthened, and in time the lessons of this case will be forgotten, corners will again be cut, and perhaps another Bell will emerge to protect the consequences of his compromises. It is the way of the world. You are unusually pessimistic, merely realistic. But come, enough of such dismal ruminations. I see from this morning's Times that there is a curious matter in Shropshire involving a disputed inheritance and an allegedly forged will. Shall we turn our attention to more straightforward villainy? Yet before we could pursue any new investigation, we received one final visitor connected to the Midnight Express affair. Mr. Edwin Marlowe, the railway clerk whose initial account had brought the case to our attention, appeared at our door bearing a bottle of excellent port and expressing gratitude that bordered on effusiveness. "You have saved countless lives, Mr. Holmes. Who knows how many more might have vanished had you not exposed Bell's crimes? The railway is instituting new procedures, new safeguards. Your work has had consequences far beyond the capture of a single criminal." Holmes accepted the thanks with his usual awkward grace, though I could see he was genuinely touched by Marlowe's sincerity. After our visitor had departed, he uncorked the port and poured us each a glass. "Perhaps there is some satisfaction to be taken after all, Watson. If our investigation prompts genuine reform, if future travellers are made safer through improved oversight and procedures, then the effort was not entirely in vain." We drank to that modest hope, and the conversation turned to other matters. Yet I observed that Holmes's mood had lightened considerably, and when he settled into his chair with the evening paper, there was something approaching contentment in his expression. The Phantom of the Midnight Train case remained, for me, an object lesson in the dangers of accepting easy explanations and the value of persistent inquiry. The supernatural had been revealed as methodical crime, the random had been shown to follow a pattern, and the helpful had been exposed as the deadly. It was, in many ways, a quintessential Holmes investigation, demonstrating his particular genius for seeing past misdirection to the essential truth beneath. As I write these words some months after the events described, I can report that Thomas Bell was tried, convicted and executed for his crimes. The railway company underwent significant reforms in its certification and safety procedures. Albert Pritchard received compensation and eventually found employment with a rival company whose management valued integrity over expedience. And the Midnight Express continues its nightly journey, though I confess I have no particular desire to ride it again. I look across the room at Holmes, who sits absorbed in a monograph on the variations in cigar ash from different tobacco-growing regions, and I am struck once again by the remarkable nature of his talents. In a world of shadows and deception, of carefully constructed facades and convenient lies, he represents the possibility that truth can be discovered through reason, that justice can prevail through patience and observation. "Holmes," I say, interrupting his studies, "what was it, ultimately, that convinced you of Bell's guilt? What single element proved decisive?" He considers the question with the care he brings to all matters of importance. "There was no single element, Watson. Rather, it was the accumulation of details, each individually explicable, but collectively damning. But if I were forced to identify the moment when certainty displaced suspicion, it was when I realized that the chemical residue could only have been placed there by someone with specific access and authority. Everything else followed from that recognition. And the rest was merely confirmation." The rest was building a case that would satisfy a court of law, which is a different matter entirely from satisfying one's own certainty. But yes, once I understood the mechanism, the identity of the perpetrator became almost inevitable. He returns to his monograph, and I to my writing. Outside, the fog is rising again over Baker Street, wrapping the city in its familiar embrace. But here, in these rooms illuminated by gaslight and warmed by the fire, there is clarity and order. It is enough, I think, for one evening. It is enough for a lifetime's work. The phantom has been unmasked, the mystery solved, and justice, however imperfectly, served. There is no mystery so great, Holmes once remarked, as that which depends upon being unnoticed. Thomas Bell had operated successfully for weeks precisely because he hid in plain sight, protected by the assumption that helpful cooperation implied innocence. It was a mistake that cost him everything, and it serves as a reminder that in the end, evil cannot withstand the sustained scrutiny of a mind determined to perceive truth. That, perhaps more than any specific detail of the case, is the lesson I shall carry forward. And it is the lesson I hope those who read this account will take from the strange and terrible affair of the Phantom of the Midnight Train.